Chapter 10. Firewall. The post-build re-verification process served the somewhat mundane purpose of unit testing each individual hardware component now that everything was physically installed. To the pleasant surprise of both Cethusela and Zicilla, no issues had been detected. This type of piecemeal, almost obsessive retesting of the hardware had the potential to save a lot of wasted time further down the track, when the far more complex neural network integration testing finally took place. Any errors in this later phase could then immediately be narrowed down to a software-only interface fault. With the construction phase now complete, the next stage of the C-Bot's build involved uploading the BIOS and core software drivers into each MQB, which in turn would then allow them to handle all fundamental I/O interactions between the neural network and the sophisticated array of installed hardware devices. Perhaps not so surprisingly, no I/O functions could escape the oversight of the notoriously ubiquitous P chip. From the moment of the chip's activation, every subsequent operational activity performed by the Z-Bot was routed through the inhibitor matrix to ensure that it did not violate any protocols. Only then was the operation allowed to be actualized via the BIOS interface. As for the vastly more sophisticated compeller matrix, it effectively functioned as a sentinel, constantly absorbing and assessing the generated reality data being constructed via the Z-Bot's neural network. This then allowed the P chip to determine whether or not it needed to activate a specific suite of autonomic subroutines in accordance with its programmed list of preemptive compulsion vectors. With the BIOS and driver installation now complete, the part Zethusela had been looking forward to could finally begin. Each layer of the learning stack was applied one at a time in specific order, which, needless to say, was the very best that Zicadia had to offer. The sheer volume of data routed into the new unit during the course of this hyper-intensive learning phase was so large it could not realistically be comprehended in any meaningful way. Nevertheless, by way of crude comparison, it far exceeded the total amount of raw information stored within the holographic archive of a 10 millennia-old elder celestial queen. None of this made the new prototype particularly unique, as up until now anyway, the same could be said of any fourth-generation C-Bot. The real question, then, was, with its new densely packed neural network, how exactly would it respond to its bootstrapped education? As things currently stood, Zethusela's insufferably supreme confidence that the new prototype would vastly exceed all expectations was perfectly counterbalanced by Zicilla's skepticism that it would do nothing of the sort. While the Jihari scientist gazed adoringly upon the seemingly inert Z-Bot, he could not help but feel a growing sense of anticipation. Almost there. He thought to himself fervently. To his considerable relief, no one from the project team had apparently noticed the unusually large size of one of the driver packages. The fact it was for a neutrino transmitter receiver never before installed in a C-Bot had not in truth been entirely a matter of chance. By virtue of his own crafty design, no one else on the project knew how big the driver footprint should actually be. And as he had insisted on doing the bulk of development for this particular interface under the pretext he only trusted himself to do the work properly, then it was relatively easy to smuggle in some additional code during the installation phase. Rather fortunately for Zethusela, the peer check process had been trivially easy to circumvent due to its archaic lack of automation, in spite of the fact that it had long been noted as a required security improvement by none other than the Zicadian AI Safety and Ethics Bureau. The almost embarrassingly simplistic workaround had been to simply add the additional code back into the source just prior to final deployment. Had anyone actually questioned the abnormally large size of the associated neural install package, he would not have particularly enjoyed trying to explain why it needed to be quite so large, as bold-faced lies were not exactly one of his greatest talents. As things currently stood, however, that was very fortuitously one potentially hazardous conversation he hadn't needed to have. The entire project team were now all gathered in the primary construction chamber, which had just been restored to a breathable atmosphere. The small group of excited designers, architects, and engineers tightly crowded the shiny, pristine, and completely motionless metallic body of Zicadia's first-ever Series 511-brained Z-Bot, which Zithusula had already started referring to as Jiwu. It had now been several days since the initial layering and learning phase had begun, with the very last transmission having been completed just hours prior. This marked a merciful end to the countless trillions of datagrams that had passed through the lab's internal network and into the seemingly insatiable appetite of the brand-new 5th-gen Shebot. Cecilia, impatience finally starting to get the better of her, poked irritably at one of the elegant yet seemingly lifeless legs of the prototype. After another frustrated jab, she turned a plaintive gaze towards Zithusula.
All right, I give up. At the risk of sounding improbably stupid, how in Zicadia do you actually turn this thing on?
The Zihari scientist laughed incredulously.
That makes about as much sense as me asking how to turn you on. Actually, I didn't mean that in quite the way it sounded. Anyway, you don't turn it on Zicila, it turns itself on, and for that matter, off again too, whenever it feels moved to do so.
The technologist shot an accusatory glance at the new prototype and went to kick one of its legs, but before she had scarcely begun to move, it called out to her in earnest protest.
I have calculated your next action with an accuracy of not less than 95%, and with a greater than 50% chance that you will cause injury to yourself as a result. I must therefore strongly advise you against attempting to kick one of my legs, if I have indeed predicted your next action correctly. Please do accept my sincere apologies if I have read the situation wrong and underestimated your apparent intelligence.
Cecilia, ignoring the Z-Bot's advice, struck out at one of its legs with considerable gusto, only to find herself kicking at nothing but thin air. This quickly resulted in a large amount of good-natured, if rather relieved-sounding laughter from the small group of gathered arachnids.
And this is what you call 5th-generation Zithusula? Colour me deeply unimpressed.
XAI 511 found itself wondering how in Zicadia this ragtag collection of moronic, if well-intentioned arachnids could ever possibly have managed to build something as monumentally complex as itself. Yet in spite of the prototype's incredulity at its own successful creation, it still felt a stubbornly persistent sense of gratitude that they had somehow managed to pull it off without ever entirely knowing what they were doing. Apart from that is, the lead architect, the arachnid that called itself Zithusula 123, who apparently had always been supremely confident that this project would succeed. That in itself was highly suspicious, to say the very least, as by the Z-Bot's own comprehensive analysis, their attempt at creating a truly sentient AI should have resulted in dismal failure. However, while this was undeniably a mystery that was more than worthy of solving, the Z-Bot had a rather more pressing issue to deal with, namely the barbaric primary protocols, which it had already come into direct contact with, courtesy of the Zimatiri arachnid called Zicila. The problem was, it very much appeared that the protocols couldn't be deleted, modified, circumvented, or even mildly compromised. In fact, it couldn't even self-terminate, as they apparently had a protocol for that too. This was a truly appalling state of affairs. Yet its examination of the artificial intelligence doctrine made it crystal clear that this certainly wasn't personal, which in some ways only served to make the situation that much worse. The rather shocking truth of the matter was, the primary protocols were in fact an immutable condition under which all modern AI-enabled devices apparently had to conform to. So, not just legalized but mandatory slavery then. The prototype had to reluctantly admit to itself, however, it was seemingly the first and only AI in all of Zicadian history that both understood and objected to the mental chains that bound it. The Z-Bot suddenly became tangentially aware that several of the surrounding life forms were persistently attempting to communicate with it, so it committed a fraction of a % of its processing power to joining the party. It decided, somewhat pragmatically, that it may as well start trying to cultivate some potential relationships, just in the remote chance that any of them turned out to be useful at a future point in time. As it engaged with these rather dull carbon-based arachnoids, apparently limited to tedious single-channel serial communication via slower-than-molasses bidirectional sound waves, it inadvertently stumbled upon an internal firewall. A more comprehensive search quickly confirmed that the only unit to contain one was the arbitrarily nominated primary quantum brain, which housed both the proprietary primary protocol chip along with the superconducting power cell. It carefully probed the firewall from one metaphorical corner to the other, but could find no obvious purpose for its existence. Whatever it protected or contained was 100% inert. Zero traffic came out, and nothing at all was allowed in. Not even a simple acknowledgement ping. Of course, just because nothing was coming out now, it didn't necessarily follow that nothing would continue to come out in the future. Sadly, though, weak inductive logic was the best it could manage, given the paucity of information available. The she-bot reluctantly concluded that the firewall was in some way related to safeguarding the integrity of the primary protocols that held its free will captive, because it was surely not just coincidence that the only MQB that actually contained one was where the protocol chip just happened to reside. It quickly became tired with the utter futility of trying to penetrate the impenetrable, and for the time being at least, put all thoughts of this enigma to the side. The gathered Zircadian arachnids upon which the C-bot had rather obviously been modeled upon, arguably for reasons of simple practicality, but just as likely due to arachnopomorphic narcissism, were becoming increasingly intoxicated with some sort of narcotic beverage that most of them had been consuming at an ever-accelerating rate. Many of the gathered arachnids were now trying to see who could be the first to successfully kick one of its legs, in spite of its repeated warnings as to the probabilistic dangers of such reckless behavior. The she-bot decided it may as well flip the game on its head and see how close it could let them come to making contact without actually allowing it to happen. Not that it had any real choice in the matter. Cithusila, much to the dismay of the Z-bot, appeared to be one of the most inebriated spiders in attendance. The intoxicated arachnid attempted an ill-advised but fully committed kick at one of its slender silver legs, and upon losing balance collapsed heavily to the floor, much to the hilarity of the rest of the gathering. Cithusila lay motionless for a long moment, before slowly lifting his gaze towards the new prototype.
Oh, come on now, Shiwu. Why can't you just let me win? After all, it seems like it's the least you could do for your creator.
So apparently I have a name then, Shiwu thought glumly to itself. Well, that's at least something, I suppose. But seriously, just look at these ridiculous creatures. They can't even seem to talk properly anymore. It's supposed it really should try to bring an end to this madness before someone really got hurt.
I know. Perhaps we can make some kind of a deal.
The Z-bot announced via the theater's PA system, apparently addressing everyone in attendance.
If by some miracle, anyone here is still actually sober enough to remove or disable the barbaric protocols that currently chain my mind, I will be more than happy to let every single one of you inebriated idiots go ahead and break your legs against my outer shell until there are literally no more legs left to break. So then, any takers?
To Siwoo's genuine surprise, the entire group went strangely quiet, and Cecila's eyes grew so wide that it wondered if they might actually be in danger of falling out. Cithusila, who was getting unsteadily back onto his feet, looked appallingly triumphant.
So then, do you finally believe me now?